Well, everybody knows that absence of evidence isn't evidence of absence. But this is not a scientifically rational inference that is comparable with the first principles bottom-up approach from basic physics in the way that Hector and I and our colleagues think about how the human brain evolved.
The Rational View is a weekly series hosted by me, Dr. Alan Scott, providing a rational, evidence-based perspective on important societal issues.
Produced by Soapbox Media.
The world needs evidence-based public policy now more than ever. Making the right decisions should not be partisan politics. Please help spread The Rational View by going to patron.podbean.com/The Rational View. Together, we can make a better future. Hello and welcome to another episode of The Rational View. In this episode, I'm continuing to look at consciousness and cognition and the working memory that sets humans apart from all other animals. Human working memory can be roughly quantified to hold about 7 items at once in a sequence and allow conscious manipulation, consideration, and attention to about 4 of them at a time. These numbers are surprisingly consistent across all humans. The size of working memory in humans is also much larger than in our nearest relatives, the great apes. The ability to remember sequence information also seems to be unique. So today I'm interviewing a researcher who studies the evolution of the human capacity for cognition. His vocabulary and working memory are both immense. I certainly need to stretch my working memory to the limit just to parse some of his most elegant utterances. For example, in a recent exchange, he opined the following gem. Quote, however, as Karl Friston reminded us, the mathematical itinerancy of stochastic, genetical, and epigenetical mechanisms in ergodic systems can explain the appearances, disappearances, and reappearances of some technological outcomes of early Pleistocene human behaviors from a far more rational scientific basis than can any self-justifying assertion that absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. Now, if you followed that, you are a human with a great working memory. Let's get to the bottom of this interesting topic. If you enjoy what you're hearing, I would ask that you please press like on your podcast app. Please share it around on your social media and feel free to support the podcast. Love to hear from you. Professor Emeritus Michael Walker is a paleoanthropologist with degrees in medicine, physiology, and prehistoric archaeology from Oxford University, including his doctorate on the prehistorical physical anthropology and archaeology of the southeast Spanish region of Murcia. He established systematic, important Paleolithic excavation sites, one with fossil remains of Neanderthals in deep sediments from 130,000 to 40,000 years ago, and a much older site between 900,000 and 772,000 years ago, where he discovered evidence of fire as well as stone artifacts and hand axes. The unique hand axe reawakened Dr. Walker's interest in neuroscience, and in particular about how cognition might lead to surprising manual behavior that was not passed on culturally. This hypothesis, based on the free energy principle, has implications on the evolution of human cognition and calls into question time-honored interpretations by anthropologists about human cultural transmission. Dr. Walker, welcome to The Rational View.
Hello, how are you?
Very good. So you and my previous guest, Dr. Hector Manrique, have been collaborating for over a decade on scientific research and publishing interesting work on the evolution of working memory. It's thought that our capacity for larger working memory is the key mental difference between humans and great apes. Do we know anything about the biological mechanisms behind memory, or are they stored as like patterns of connections in our neural networks, or the mechanism? What do we know about the mechanisms of actual memory, biologically speaking? Is there any neurobiology that tells us where memory is or how memory is stored?
Most neuroscientists seem to believe that memory is widely distributed in the brain, not only human brains, but the brains, of course, of other creatures. However, one of the aspects which is of particular interest to me and to Hector is that the development of memory over our lifespan does seem to be associated with the development over the first 25 years of our life of what are known as white matter nerve fiber tracts that join up different parts of the brain. It takes a long time for these to fully develop in our species, whereas in neighboring species like chimpanzees and gorillas, they seem to develop much earlier, much quicker. We seem to have a kind of 10-year time lag before our memory is completely, as it were, ready for service in that sort of neurobiological sense. This kind of delay between phylogenetically related species is known as heterochrony, the difference in time in which different things develop during the developing lifespan of a creature, during our ontological development, ontogenetical development. This is, of course, part and parcel of modern evo-devo, evolutionary developmental modern evolutionary synthesis, and there's nothing to be surprised about it. But with regard to humans, we do have to ask ourselves how, when, and with what evidence can we show that this evolutionary separation, this phylogenetical differentiation, took place during human evolution. The short of the matter is, of course, we don't have preserved brains, so it's very hard to know from the immediately neuronal point of view. However, what we do have are skeletons and skulls of early humans, and in particular, there is a well-known skeleton that's been studied now for a few decades that was excavated in Kenya, known as the Turkana boy skeleton of about 1.5 million years ago. This is a remarkably complete skeleton of an early Homo erectus, a forebear of our modern Homo sapiens, a long, long time before, of course. Now, this particular specimen has been very well studied, and as it was studied over the years, it became increasingly clear that it had reached almost modern fully developmental skeletal age at about the age of 9 or 10 years old.
Wow.
At first, it was thought to have been about 14 or 13 or even 12, but later dental work carried out at University College London showed it was even earlier than that. Now, this is surprising because the skeleton was already that of an almost fully developed adolescent modern human, apart from the fact that the brain must have been a lot smaller because the already formed skull could only have contained a brain about 2/3 the size of ours. So that's the bit that's different, so to speak. Now, if he was fully developed, almost at the age of 10, let's say he became a fully modern adult at, let's say, 12 or 13, he would still have been about 12 years behind with regard to the development of those important white matter tracts in the brain that are so bound up with connecting different parts of the brain and with the development of working memory, as has been shown by studies in modern adolescence.
Interesting.
This would suggest that his working memory may have been little more than, say, that of a modern 6-year-old kid, even though he was a big, hulking, strapping lad. And of course, in those days, almost certainly, modern language had not developed. Symbolic language and symbolic communication of any time may have been minimal, of any type may have been minimal. So we have to imagine these rampaging, rumbustious young people, rather like our 6-year-olds in the playground, unable to talk to each other, and yet they nevertheless, of course, he died early, not surprisingly, but then they all did. So
Amazing.
We came from these, and we managed to cope. They managed to cope a little bit better than the chimpanzees and gorillas. And that's the missing link, so to speak, which begins to tell us something about perhaps how our brains developed in terms of their cognitive ability. Even 1.5 million years ago, let's say, they were only part of the way there to as we are now. And the journey from there wasn't a long, leisurely, inexorable, gradual ascent of man, as some people have claimed. No, far from it. It was very much a stop-go procedure. And we know this from looking at the archaeological record of some quite complicated stone tools that were made between about 1,800,000 years ago and as late perhaps as even less than 100,000.
Yes,
and we call
you have
them
some disagreements with the consensus view that there's been this monolithic advancement in civilization throughout history in the early and middle Pleistocene in that time period, as you just referenced. And I've read some of your papers. You and Hector have coined the term of zone of bounded surprisal to describe a species level of response to a set of unexpected observations. And surprisal, as you said, indicates a mismatch between observation and expectation. So it means that, there's a problem with the model in your brain as to what you're seeing. What does it mean to have a narrow zone of bounded surprisal, and what characteristic behaviors provide evidence for this in other species?
Well, what it basically means is that you are relatively unresponsive, if the zone is narrow, to things which are out of the ordinary, and particularly what other people do. It doesn't strike you as being peculiar. It simply strikes you as being totally irrelevant. It's something that really doesn't exist. It's a bit like, let's say, things in our environment. It's something which is there but isn't really registered and affects the way you personally behave. This seems to be part of the reason why it's so difficult for anybody to train a chimpanzee or a bonobo to copy with great faithfulness, great fidelity with regard to the precision and accuracy of the movements, to copy something which is being performed in front of them. They can't learn in the way that we do. As Hector said the other day, they emulate rather than imitate. They know what the end should look like, but they really aren't able to understand what's going on to get there. In other words, what they are being shown doesn't seem to be relevant to them. They disregard it because it is not within their range of things that they can register and work on. In other words, they have a relatively narrow zone of bounded surprisal, whereas ours seems to have increased during evolution, probably in relationship to the heterochrony that I mentioned earlier, the slow development of our system of recording different memories, memory of what we do, the working memory, the memory of things that we've done, our episodic memory, the memory of the things we're going to do tomorrow, our prospective memory. We can mold all these into a seamless way of looking at things, and so that when something strange, something rather unusual happens, we refer it backwards and forwards to what we have seen, what we can do, what we might be able to do if we pay attention, and if this unusual thing registers with us. Now, I don't think that there's a lot of archaeological evidence going back between 2 million and 1 million years ago even, to show that our early ancestors in the genus Homo had the same level of ability to register and respond to and work upon things that seemed rather unusual to them. Rather, just the opposite. They probably paid not so much attention to them, ignoring them, disregarding them. Even things they themselves did, which were out of the ordinary. And this is what really sparked my interest when I was excavating with my team a site almost 1 million years ago here in southeastern Spain. And we found a lot of small chipped stone artifacts, but only one of the so-called hand axes, which are rather larger objects, rather like a large almond, which have been shaped and fashioned by flaking on opposite sides. Why only one when so many other small tools were there? Was it simply a fortuitous accident by one or other of the people who visited the cave that neither other people, let alone the person, him or herself, paid much attention to, and it was just left there? That's a possibility, and it is a possibility for which there are known mathematical models on the basis of what is known as mathematical itinerancy, particularly of stochastic processes, which are, in other words, relatively random ones, to put it rather crudely. And it's quite conceivable that this kind of odd behavior, which went unrecognized, maybe even by the person who him or herself did it, was quite common, and can explain why in different parts of the world we find occasionally such things in widely scattered places in at least 3 different continents, and in very different times, between about, as I said before, 1.8 million years ago and perhaps as recently as less than 100,000 years ago.
Wow.
Why was this?
What you're saying, let me just go over what,
Yeah, sure.
and try to explain this. So you're saying that these complex stone tools, the large hand axes, they I think what your thesis says is that they require some planning to build. They take some care, and you need to plan your actions for a particular goal. And you're saying that this isn't something that the early hominids had the capacity for planning or for recognizing others doing and picking up. Their memories, their brains weren't able to envision a set of steps to reach this goal. They're basically living in the present. And you claim that a certain advance in working memory capacity over our nearest relatives was necessary for the early hominids to start being able to learn from discoveries rather than just haphazardly rediscovering tool usage or fire control. How does this work? What is the evolutionary thing that needed to happen to make this feasible?
Well, I'd like to make 2 points here. The first is that clearly, if you can make these rather complicated tools, you do have something in your memory that most chimpanzees and similar animals don't have, which is the awareness that once you've started out on one particular way of doing something, you either have to abandon it or continue to the end. There's no changing track halfway through and turning what you're doing into something else. You have the memory that you can't really reverse things. This is quite important because the knowledge that you can't reverse things, this knowledge of the irreversibility, is all part and parcel of what a working memory greater than, at least greater than 2, certainly one of no less than 3, is capable of doing in a way that is not capable if you don't have that, as our colleague at UCLA, Professor Dwight Reed, has pointed out. And the second point I want to make is that there has to be a mechanism by which this occurs. And the mechanism, Hector and I believe, is that which UCL's Professor Karl Friston has championed, which is known as active inference, which points out to the way that very likely neurons in the brain work on the basis of some kind of neurobiological inference machine using a Bayesian statistical approach to calculate, as it were, the conditional likelihood or probability of a particular outcome being consistent with continued existence. In other words, this is often called self-evidencing. And the evolution of this may well have occurred, and is very likely to have occurred, if the theory is correct, and it's based on physical principles that go back to the 19th century. This isn't some kind of modern gee whiz scientific discovery. It's simply the development of principles that have quite a long tradition in rational scientific thinking. And if one takes this as a reasonable model, as we do, then it would seem that very slowly the combined effect of this was to prolong life, was to enable the slower development of the nervous system to become the very sophisticated neurobiological inference machine, which some of his colleagues, and we accept this, call the human mechanistic mind. Now, once you mention the word mechanistic, of course, some of our colleagues who are trained in the arts and the social sciences and the humanities begin to sneer and use all sorts of arguments, say, no, you're talking through the side of your head. The reason that that stuff appears and disappears in the archaeological record over nearly 2 million years is simply because everybody knows that absence of evidence isn't evidence of absence. But this is not a scientifically rational inference that is comparable with the first principles, bottom-up approach from basic physics in the way that Hector and I and our colleagues think about how the human brain evolved to be different from that of chimpanzees and gorillas, and how our behavior has become different over a very long, slow, and faltering system of evolution. There wasn't some kind of gradual, inexorable, upward and onward, seamless trend towards cultural sophistication carried out, but from the very beginning, by social transmission and cultural evolution. No.
Interesting.
We think this only began to occur after about 600 or 500,000 years ago, which at the very earliest, according to some very distinguished linguists, was about the earliest time one might ever think that symbolic communication between individuals of our species or our ancestors developed. In other words, language. We feel that before there was, that in these very early periods of time, before then, the stone tools are not telling us about symbolic communication, contrary to what some rather fanciful archaeologists and others, and even some anthropologists, have wanted to believe. We think this is making the wish the father to the thought, whereas rational science doesn't work that way.
Sure. So I mean, what evidence is there? Is there evidence of when you think knowledge did start to accumulate? What time period? You said 500,000 years ago is kind of the earliest, but you're basically saying that the evolution of a larger working memory was key to being able to emulate or being able to copy behaviors correctly, to be able to learn from sequences, to be able to plan, and to be able to have language. And what does the archaeological record show us?
No, I think we're talking really about the ability to imitate faithfully, not to emulate.
Right.
Chimpanzees and so on emulate. They know how they can see what the end result might look like, but they're unable to faithfully carry out the different manual operations, let's say, that one of the human handlers might be trying to teach them. No, we don't. It isn't so much a question of emulation as that the production of particular artifacts of a fairly complicated manual, in a fairly complicated manual way, may not always have been recognized, even by the person who made it or made them, as being particularly relevant for their existence. So they weren't registered, let alone by other people who just regarded them as something peculiar, which was totally pointless.
Can you maybe give us a little bit more information as to how a larger working memory allows that? You said, it allows inference, but can you maybe tell us a little bit about the details of how a larger working memory would allow this advance?
Yes. Here we are once again, I think, wanting to relate the evolution of a working memory which had to be, Hector and I would say, at least of level 3. Ours nowadays is regarded as capable of coping with 7 chunks of stuff at the same time. But it would have had to have been at least at the level of being able to manipulate at least 3 different chunks at once. Mm-hmm. But this is reached nowadays, as I said, by 6-year-olds. But we think that this may still have been, as it were, the adult level, if our young Turkana fellow at the age was a young adult at the age of only 9 or 10, and whose neuronal substructure involving forememory was still far less developed because adulthood was reached so relatively early in life. This is or at least my suggestion, and it would seem not unreasonable that only in subsequent during subsequent periods of the Pleistocene, that's to say, from about 1.5 million years ago onwards, that more flexible appreciation by not only people who made things, but other people who were watching them making things and beginning to learn how to copy them, began to impinge on early human societies. It is not surprising, perhaps, that the size of the brain itself began to increase by and large after about 1 million years ago. But, and this is a point we have made, a big brain in itself isn't what causes or doesn't correlate directly with, let's say, intelligence. Right. For example, there are known and published cases of people with very small brains who have mathematical competence. And there was one, the famous French writer, Anatole France, who got a Nobel Prize. So, brain size in itself is not the issue. What is at issue is the way that different parts of the brain can connect. And this involves the interconnection of the different aspects of memory that psychologists define. We don't know exactly how and when all this occurred. What we do know is that roughly from about, let's say, 600,000 years ago onwards, there is increasing tendency at some archaeological sites to see the standardization of fairly complicated stone artifacts and of other aspects of Paleolithic existence, which imply a level of teaching of skills, of skillfulness, that can only be acquired by careful learning of the precise and accurate ways in which the individual manual procedures needed to get the result are carried out. In other words, there has to be attention, and there has to be the memory of not forgetting how to do things. This all sounds a bit simple-minded, but it isn't. It's really very complex because it involves, when one looks at the way that the underlying processes that are needed to make a complex neurobiological influence machine exist in brains, to get from the simpler brains or the simpler systems in our nearest relatives to ours has definitely involved an evolutionary process, which in part, I think, can be equated with the relatively long period of time it takes for our white matter nerve fiber tracts that join not just the front and back of the brain, but several lobes of the brain to develop completely, which normally nowadays is reached at about the age of perhaps 25.
Wow.
Few people lived to be that age, probably a million years ago. So
we had this lengthening of the adolescent period that allowed our brains to develop to the much higher level of interconnectedness, and the mechanism of working memory is definitely the key over, for example, just the mass of the brain. So this change in the development from being mature at 9 years old, like the Turkana boy, to being brain mature at 25 years old, for example, is one of the keys to the difference between humanity and our predecessors. And before you go on, I'm just going to a logistical thing here. My Zoom meeting is going to end in about a minute, so maybe we could just wrap up very quickly with a final statement from you. Do you have anything you would like to leave us with?
Well, what I'd like to leave you with is what I said a little bit earlier on. We aren't special in the way that some people want to claim, that we have a particularly special clever clogs evolutionary trajectory built up over hundreds of thousands of years by cumulative cultural knowledge via social transmission from long, long ago, from as early maybe as before 2 million years ago. No, I think it was very much stop and go. And it was by luck that maybe 500,000 years ago, the neurobiological evolution of our brains permitted that kind of complex social behavior, probably favored by language.
If you'd like to follow up with more in-depth discussions, please come find us on Facebook at The Rational View and join our discussion group. If you like what you're hearing, please consider visiting my Patreon page at patron.podbean.com/therationalview. Thanks for listening.